r/rules horror. Posted by u/KunSeii. Burial ground exploration, why we keep to the path. I recently posted a set of rules for exploring burial grounds and was asked what happens if you don't stick to the path. In replying, I got a bit carried away and exceeded the character limit, so I thought I would go ahead and share the story in a separate post. Why do we keep to the path? You can leave the path, but I advise keeping it in sight on at least one side at all times. If you don't, you may look up to find that it is not where you last saw it. In many cases, all you will be able to see in all four directions is a sea of headstones. If this happens, do not panic. Look at the numbers on the gravestone and count them down in order to reach the path. If you're at a 2-digit grave number, count down to 0. If at a 3-digit, use the row number and count down to 0. If neither of these work, then your last resort is to follow the letter blocks by repeatedly counting down rows and graves to 0. So if you're in F, you'll need to get through F, E, D, C, B, and A. At the end of A, you'll at least find a border, if not an exit, and you work your way back from there. Cemeteries are set up logically, and if you ground yourself in logic and follow it, you can navigate your way out. Be warned that some of these cemeteries are pretty big. One particular one that I'm fond of is 150 acres surrounded by a deep tree line. As for what will happen, that entirely depends on the residents. The path is the road and is generally understood to be traveled upon by visitors and residents alike. The graves, however, are a bit more personal and are a bit akin to standing on someone's front steps unwelcome. If you leave in peace quickly, then it's not worth the trouble for the residents. But if you hang around a bit too long, something may want a word with you. A few years back, I went into the cemetery with my friend Maria and her boyfriend Ethan. Maria is adopted, and a few years back, we did an ancestry DNA test and found her biological family. Ever since then, she's been super into genealogy, building her family tree, and has been my most frequent companion when exploring burial grounds. Ethan had a bit of jealousy when he saw how much time we were spending together, although he thought it was stupid when Maria explained what we were doing. We invited him to join us to see what it was all about. I showed him a list of the famous burials in the cemetery, and he got very excited to see that his favorite baseball player growing up was buried there. I promised him that we could stop and visit, but this turned out to be a huge mistake. We explored quite a bit, and Ethan complained the entire time. He wanted to know why we couldn't bring the car in, why we didn't cut across the graves, and why we kept a spotter on the path. Finally, we arrived at the baseball player's grave. Section L, row 27, grave 138. Immediately I got a bad feeling. His row was about halfway down section L and his grave number was almost into section N. There was no path in between the sections. Ethan could not keep an eye on the path, we'd have to keep an eye on Ethan. I told Ethan it was a bad idea and that we should head out. He told me I was being ridiculous and that he wasn't missing this. Begrudgingly, I watched Maria and Ethan head into the vast field of graves and set 5 minutes on my watch. I watched as they became smaller and smaller, until I could barely distinguish one from the other. As my watch hit 3 minutes, I texted Maria that they had 1 minute and 30 seconds to get back to the path. Thankfully it went through. I didn't want to have to blow my whistle. Cemeteries are a bit of a dead zone, no pun intended, when it comes to cell service, so I know Maria set her watch as well, but this couldn't always be trusted. I saw one of the figures begin to grow larger as it headed toward me. A few moments later, I could see that it was Maria. She looked worried. She informed me that Ethan refused to leave before he got his photo. He said our rules were stupid and it hadn't been 5 minutes anyway. She held up her watch just as it was turning to 3 minutes. Mine was at 4 minutes and 30 seconds. This is not unusual, and why we agreed to always let the spotter call time. I kept my eyes on Ethan. I could see him bending over, probably taking a selfie. I was immediately jolted when Maria screamed. I turned my head towards her to see her face had gone white. "Black Hood, behind the angel," she hissed out. I slowly pivoted my view and looked behind the angel statue resting in section L, row 1. There was nothing. Now I don't think Maria is crazy at all. I fully believe that she saw a black hooded figure move behind the angel statue. I also know it was not there at the time I looked, and I am of the full belief that it was not there to harm us, but to distract us. I know this, because when I looked up, I could no longer see Ethan. Maria and I looked at each other in horror. 5 minutes, I said, and immediately charged into section L. I ran as fast as I could in the direction that Ethan and Maria had headed. I reached row 27 and began running left, counting the graves as I went. 101, 113, 129, 138. I stopped, my chest burning from the run. I'm certainly not in the best of shape, but I was running on pure adrenaline. I saw Ethan's cell phone lying on the ground. I picked it up and it was still warm. No sign of him anywhere. My phone buzzed, it was a text from Maria, my time was running out. I made a beeline for the path, hopping over short headstones as I went, probably offending dozens of residents in doing so, but that wasn't my greatest concern at that moment. I made it to the path with 10 seconds to spare. We looked around and there was no sign of Ethan in any direction. At this point, we did something that I absolutely cannot caution against enough. You see, at nearly every burial ground, there is an office. How often that office is staffed and by whom varies greatly depending on the grounds. Cemetery offices hate me. They do not like my hobby, they do not want to waste time talking to me, they hate looking up information for me, and they especially don't want to hear that this hobby created liability for them. Unfortunately, Ethan was missing, we had no idea where he'd gone, and no idea how to find him. We looked up to see the sky was beginning to darken and daylight was fading. We needed help. Now the staff may vary at each of these offices, but there are 3 primary people you will always see there. Stuart, the site manager, will kick you out on site. He wants nothing to do with this hobby and will call you every name in the book if he realizes what you're doing. Pearl is the administrative assistant and record keeper who looks like she was there when the cemetery first opened and is typically very kind and helpful, unless Stuart is looking over her shoulder. Louis is the groundskeeper. He knows the cemetery better than anyone, can find any gravesite for you, and takes genuine pride in the work he does. He has an understanding with the residents. They don't see him as an intruder. But, if he thinks you're causing trouble, he won't hesitate to boot you from the property. If anyone knew where Ethan was, it was Louis. Maria and I both agreed that we needed to break Rule 3 and talk to the office staff. We linked arms back to back and began walking towards the office. I looked through the window to see Stuart at his desk. Damn it. I told Maria I needed a distraction. She nodded her understanding, whipped out her cell phone, and dialed the front office. I saw Pearl pick up the phone and Maria demanded to speak to the office manager. As soon as she was transferred to Stuart, she began screaming about the bird droppings on her grandmother's headstone. It would have been hilarious if we weren't in such a terrible situation. I walked through the door and was warmly greeted by Pearl. I told her I was having difficulty finding a friend and asked if there was a groundskeeper available to assist me. Pearl smiled, completely oblivious that my friend was not a resident, picked up a radio, and asked Louis to come to the office. I thanked her for her assistance and headed outside. Outside the office, Eugenia W. Spiel was calling Stuart every terrible name she could think of when she saw me, thanked Stuart for his time, and hung up on him. A few moments later Louis pulled up in his golf cart. He asked which section we were looking in. I informed him that our friend had gone missing, and all we found was his cell phone. Louis's eyes widened. How long was he out there? I replied, long enough. Louis nodded and sighed, of course he was. That's great, just great. He asked for a description, and we opened the last photo he took with the headstone. Louis called out on the radio to see if any of his guys had eyes on Ethan, but nobody did. He asked if we knew anything about his genealogy. Maria replied that she had done his family tree, but Ethan had no interest in it, so she only had up to his great-grandparents and pulled up the tree. Louis read through, picked up his radio, and called, Pearl, need a burial lookup. Last names, Benson, DeGroat, Casper, and Wolfgang. A few moments of silence passed that felt like hours. Maria and I looked at each other but no words came to us. The radio crackled to life. Benson, Casper, and Wolfgang, no. There are DeGroats in the old colonial burying ground through the woods. Louis thanked Pearl and instructed us to get into the back of the golf cart. We did as we were told. The light was nearly gone, and it would be dark soon. We sped down the path towards the tree line. At an almost imperceptible point, between 2 rows of graves, Louis drove the cart and as we reached the tree line a small dirt trail appeared. This isn't technically part of the cemetery, Louis called back, but when the land was purchased, we absorbed the burial ground as well and kept the records. It's mostly left alone. Most people don't even know it's out here. We rode through the trail as numerous branches and plant growth slapped the golf cart. It was clear that nobody had been there for a long time. Louis brought the cart to a stop. Directly ahead, we could see weathered stones sticking up through several seasons of leaves. Had Louis not known to stop here, I would have looked right past it. Many of the stones were broken in half or barely even there anymore. Louis sighed, "Here we are. Let's clean up some of these leaves and let's hope that we're on friendly ground." We got to work pushing the leaves off of the graves. I could make out a birth and death date here or there, but the stones were all but worn away at this point. Some were hard to even recognize as a headstone. Suddenly Maria let out a cry and we both ran over. There was a body under the leaves. We pulled the leaves away and it was Ethan, laying flat on his back, head resting inches from the stone, hands folded in repose across his chest, eyes closed. I felt for a pulse. He was alive. Louis lifted him and placed him in the back of the golf cart. I glanced at the stone. It was very well worn, but I could make out one word: "Degrote." As Louis drove us back to the entrance, I asked how he knew we'd find Ethan there. Louis sighed, "I didn't, but I certainly hoped we would." Clearly, whatever had him recognize that he was the blood of another resident and knew better than to take things any further. What if? Maria hesitated. What if he didn't have anyone here? Louis nodded sadly. "Let's hope that none of you ever find out. We were lucky today, very lucky." As we got back to the office, Stuart was waiting for us. I guess Pearl spilled the beans that this wasn't a simple grave location to him. "Thanks a million, Pearl." He was quick to call us irresponsible, disrespectful, and dangerous. He even threw in a lifetime ban from the grounds for our trouble. We carried Ethan to the car, thanked Louis for his time and assistance, and drove back to Maria's. When Ethan woke up he didn't want to talk about any of it. He was super on edge, eyes darting around the room, and kept backing away from us. When we finally got it out of him, he told us that after Maria had left, a tall older gentleman in a suit offered to take his photo with the baseball player's headstone. He had smiled, and the next thing he remembered was being on his hands and knees crawling. He struggled to move forward and felt himself sinking into the ground. Something was moving towards him, and no matter how hard he tried to get away, he could feel it drawing closer. The last thing he remembered was feeling two hands pressing against his ribs and all of the air draining out of his lungs. When we explained where we found him, he refused to believe it. He accused us of drugging him and left angry with both of us. A few days later he broke up with Maria via text and blocked both of us. Neither of us ever heard from him again. It wasn't until much later that I remembered the photo we showed Louis, and realized it couldn't have been a selfie. It was a full body shot. I feel bad. Don't get me wrong, I never would have taken him exploring again. He wasn't cut out for it. But for Maria, Ethan was an escape from this crazy hobby of ours. We let him into our world and it nearly ended his. As for that lifetime ban? There's a colonial burial ground that I haven't gotten the chance to explore and catalog. Some of those stones went back to the 1600s. I'll have to find a way to get in contact with Louis again without tripping Stuart's radar, but where there's a will, there's a way.